The halls of Congress recently became the stage for a high-stakes examination of regional governance and federal oversight, as Representative Brandon Gill introduced a series of provocative inquiries regarding demographic shifts in Minnesota. At the center of this legislative inquiry lies a complex web of socioeconomic data points that suggest a profound transformation within the state's fiscal landscape over the last decade. Gill presented an array of empirical evidence aimed at highlighting the disproportionate reliance on public assistance programs within specific immigrant enclaves, particularly focusing on the Somali community. These statistics underscore a growing tension between traditional social safety nets and the rapid expansion of specific metropolitan populations that utilize these resources at significantly higher rates than the historical average. The testimony provided a stark visualization of how the allocation of taxpayer-funded resources, including supplemental nutrition assistance program benefits and Medicaid, has shifted to accommodate these new arrivals. The discourse moved beyond simple budgetary concerns to address the systemic implications of such heavy dependence on state-sponsored welfare systems. Witnesses called to the stand provided detailed accounts of how these financial disparities create a structural imbalance that potentially threatens the long-term economic stability of the region. Data reflected that Somali households often access food stamps and healthcare subsidies at a frequency that far outpaces that of the established local workforce, raising questions about the efficacy of current integration policies. This economic divide is not merely a matter of balance sheets, but represents a fundamental shift in the social contract between the state government and its constituents. As the hearing progressed, the focus intensified on whether these trends were an unforeseen consequence of humanitarian efforts or a predictable outcome of specific administrative choices. Critics and investigators pointed directly toward the executive chambers in St. Paul, alleging that Governor Tim Walz oversaw an environment where program integrity was consistently compromised. Testimony suggested that high-level officials within the state administration were briefed on numerous occasions regarding widespread irregularities and potential fraud within these benefit programs. Despite these warnings, the executive branch allegedly maintained a posture of calculated inaction, allowing these fiscal leaks to persist for more than 10 years without significant intervention. The narrative emerging from the Capitol suggests a deliberate blind spot in the state's oversight mechanisms, one that allowed billions in potential misappropriations to occur under the guise of social support. This perceived negligence has sparked a firestorm of debate regarding the basic responsibilities of state leaders to protect public funds from exploitation and administrative decay. The motivations behind the sustained silence from the governor's office are now being scrutinized through a political lens, with many analysts suggesting a strategic calculation. It is argued that the Somali demographic represents a pivotal voting bloc that has become indispensable to the Democratic Party's continued dominance in Minnesota's urban centers. By maintaining the flow of social services without rigorous audits, the administration is accused of fostering a patronage system that secures political loyalty at the expense of fiscal transparency. This alignment of political interest and administrative policy suggests that the lack of accountability was not an oversight but a tactical maneuver designed to solidify a reliable base of support. Such allegations frame the entire welfare crisis as a byproduct of a broader strategy aimed at maintaining power through the redistribution of public wealth. In the eyes of the committee, the documented history of ignored red flags constitutes a grave breach of public trust that extends far beyond the borders of a single state. The investigation revealed that federal funds intended for the vulnerable were frequently diverted or managed with such laxity that it invited organized efforts to defraud the system. Lawmakers argued that when a government prioritizes the preservation of a voting bloc over the integrity of its financial institutions, the entire democratic process is undermined. The evidence presented portrays a grim reality where the mechanics of the state are leveraged to serve partisan ends rather than the common good of the citizenry. As this inquiry continues to unfold, The implications for American immigration policy and state-level governance are likely to resonate across the national political landscape for years to come. The second phase of the congressional inquiry pivoted toward the granular details of fiscal mismanagement, revealing a pattern of systemic failure that critics argue was hidden in plain sight. As Representative Brandon Gill pressed the witnesses, the conversation shifted from broad demographic trends to the specific mechanics of how hundreds of millions of dollars seemingly vanished through the cracks of the Minnesota Department of Human Services. This segment of the hearing focused heavily on the Feeding Our Future scandal, a landmark case of pandemic-era fraud that many lawmakers believe is just the tip of the iceberg regarding the state's oversight failures. The testimony illuminated how decentralized benefit distribution networks allowed for a staggering lack of verification, where names on benefit rolls often failed to correspond with real individuals or eligible residents. It was highlighted that while the federal government provided the capital, the state's executive leadership acted as the primary gatekeeper, a role they allegedly abandoned in favor of political expediency. Legal experts and forensic auditors testifying before the committee painted a picture of a bureaucratic environment where willful ignorance appeared to be the standard operating procedure. They detailed how early warning signs, including whistleblowers' reports and internal red flags from mid-level civil servants, were systematically suppressed or buried under layers of administrative red tape. The hearing explored the disturbing reality that even as federal agencies began to raise concerns about the legitimacy of the numbers coming out of Minnesota, the state's leadership continued to greenlight massive payouts to unverified entities. This section of the transcript underscores a catastrophic breakdown in the chain of command, where the urgency of humanitarian aid was used as a convenient shield to deflect requests for basic financial documentation. The dialogue between Gill and the witnesses frequently returned to a single, haunting question: how could such a massive transfer of wealth occur without a single high-ranking official demanding a comprehensive audit? As the inquiry delved deeper into the relationship between the Somali community's political influence and the state's welfare policies, the atmosphere in the room grew increasingly tense. Lawmakers scrutinized the timing of specific grant approvals, noting a suspicious correlation between major election cycles and the expansion of benefit eligibility within specific zip codes. Analysis of the Minnesota voter rolls and social service databases suggested a symbiotic relationship where the expansion of the welfare state served as an effective recruitment tool for partisan mobilization. This portion of the testimony examined the ethical implications of using public funds to secure the loyalty of a burgeoning immigrant population, a move that critics argue creates a permanent underclass dependent on government largesse rather than self-sufficiency. The witnesses emphasized that this policy direction not only drains the Treasury but also hinders the genuine integration of newcomers by incentivizing reliance over employment. The hearing also brought to light the internal culture of the Walz administration, with former employees describing a culture of fear for those who dared to question the integrity of the Somali-focused programs. Documented communications between department heads suggested that any scrutiny of these specific programs was often characterized as culturally insensitive or politically motivated, effectively silencing internal critics. This strategic use of social pressure ensured that the fraud could continue unabated, as officials were more concerned with avoiding accusations of bias than with fulfilling their fiduciary duties to the taxpayers. The testimony suggested that the administration created a protected status for certain nonprofits, allowing them to operate with a level of autonomy that would be unthinkable for any other state-funded organization. This lack of parity and oversight is a central pillar of the argument that the state's failures were a matter of choice, not incompetence. Furthermore, the discussion expanded to the broader impact on Minnesota's infrastructure, including the strain on the public school system and local healthcare facilities that have had to absorb the sudden influx of non-contributing users. Economic analysts provided projections showing that the current trajectory is unsustainable, as the tax base shrinks while the demand for specialized social services continues to skyrocket. The testimony made it clear that the fiscal consequences of these policy decisions are not confined to the present, but represent a long-term liability for future generations of Minnesotans. By the end of this session, the narrative had shifted from a simple case of administrative error to a comprehensive indictment of a governance model that prioritizes the short-term gains of identity politics over the fundamental principles of responsible stewardship. The evidence presented so far suggests that the crisis in Minnesota is a cautionary tale of what happens when the mechanisms of the state are decoupled from accountability and transparency. The inquiry transitioned into a volatile exploration of the public's reaction and the escalating friction within Minnesota's diverse social fabric. As the findings from the congressional hearing began to permeate the national news cycle, the local sentiment in Minneapolis and St. Paul reached a boiling point. Residents who had long contributed to the state's tax base expressed a growing sense of betrayal, feeling that their economic security was being sacrificed for political maneuvering. The testimony highlighted a series of town hall meetings where citizens confronted local officials about the visible decline in public services despite record-high state spending. It became evident that the disparity in welfare allocation was no longer just a budgetary footnote but a primary source of civic unrest. Many lifelong residents described a landscape that had become unrecognizable due to the prioritization of certain groups over the collective interest. They pointed to crumbling local infrastructure and the stagnation of funding for rural schools as direct casualties of the massive drain on resources. This sense of being forgotten by their own government fueled a populist backlash that transcended traditional party lines. The hearing documented how the perception of unfairness acts as a corrosive agent on the principles of social cohesion and mutual respect. Lawmakers noted that when the state creates a hierarchy of need based on political utility, it risks destroying the very foundation of public trust. In response to the mounting pressure, representatives from the Democratic Farmer-Labor Party attempted to pivot the conversation toward themes of inclusivity and historical reparations. They argued that the high rates of assistance were a necessary investment in the successful resettlement of a population fleeing war and systemic instability. These defenders of the administration characterized the scrutiny from Brandon Gill as a politically motivated attack designed to stigmatize a vulnerable minority group. The debate in the hearing room mirrored the broader ideological split across the United States regarding the true purpose of the American safety net. Witnesses supporting the administration emphasized that short-term fiscal costs should be weighed against the long-term humanitarian benefits of providing a haven for refugees. They suggested that the initial struggles of the Somali community were no different from those of previous immigrant waves, who eventually became pillars of American industry. However, this optimistic view was frequently met with skepticism by members of the committee who pointed to the unique scale of modern welfare systems. Unlike the immigrants of the 19th century, today's arrivals enter a state with a vast array of automated financial support that can unintentionally discourage labor participation. The discussion turned to whether the state's generosity had become a gilded cage that trapped families in a state of perpetual poverty. This argument suggested that the administration's policies were not just fiscally irresponsible but morally questionable in their long-term impact on the community. Investigative journalists and policy experts provided testimony suggesting that this humanitarian label was being used as a strategic shield to bypass standard vetting procedures. They pointed to specific instances where funds intended for child nutrition were redirected to purchase luxury real estate and high-end vehicles for non-profit executives. This portion of the testimony provided a shocking look at the lifestyle of those who profited from the state's lack of oversight, contrasting their wealth with the poverty of the families they claimed to serve. The evidence suggested that the very people the programs were designed to help were often used as props to facilitate large-scale financial theft. This revelation shifted the narrative from a debate over policy to a documented case of criminal exploitation within the highest levels of community leadership. The details of the Feeding Our Future case were revisited with fresh intensity, showcasing the audacity of the fraud that took place under the governor's watch. Documents presented at the hearing showed that some non-profit organizers were submitting claims for tens of thousands of meals daily at locations that did not even have a functioning kitchen. Despite these glaring anomalies, the checks continued to be cut and the money continued to flow without physical inspections. This lack of due diligence was characterized by some committee members as a form of professional negligence that would result in immediate firing in any private sector corporation. The fact that no high-level officials have faced significant career consequences remains a focal point of public outrage. The social consequences of this alleged negligence began to manifest in the erosion of communal trust and the rise of parallel societies within the state. Experts testified that by allowing specific groups to operate outside the standard rules of accountability, the government had inadvertently slowed the process of cultural assimilation. Instead of integrating into the broader American economy, many new arrivals were funneled into a system that incentivized permanent dependence. The hearing explored how this dynamic creates a cycle of poverty that is difficult to break, as the benefits of staying within the welfare system often outweigh the initial rewards of entry-level employment. This economic trap was described as a disservice to the Somali community itself, depriving them of the dignity of self-sufficiency. Testimony further explored the psychological impact of living in a high-trust society that is suddenly confronted with low-trust behaviors that go unpunished. Minnesotans have traditionally prided themselves on their honesty and willingness to support those in need, assuming that everyone plays by the same rules. The discovery of systemic fraud within a specific immigrant enclave has threatened to replace this communal goodwill with skepticism and resentment. Sociologists warned that the destruction of social capital is far more difficult to repair than a simple budget deficit. If the state does not address the perception of a two-tier justice system, the social friction could lead to lasting divisions that define Minnesota for decades. As the afternoon session commenced, the focus shifted to the paper trail that supposedly led directly to the governor's inner circle. Forensic accountants revealed a series of emails and internal memos that appeared to prioritize community relations over financial integrity during the height of the fraud. These documents suggested that when auditors attempted to freeze suspicious accounts, they were met with resistance from political appointees who feared a backlash. This segment of the hearing underscored the terrifying possibility that the state's law enforcement mechanisms were being throttled by political considerations. The testimony portrayed a government that was more afraid of being called intolerant than it was of losing hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars to organized crime. Internal communications showed that officials were frequently cautioned about the optics of investigating non-profits that served the Somali population. This preoccupation with identity politics created a vacuum where accountability should have been, allowing bad actors to operate with near total impunity. Lawmakers questioned whether the state had essentially granted a fraud license to certain groups in exchange for political support. The documents hinted at a disturbing level of coordination between political strategists and administrative heads to keep the scandal quiet until after key election cycles. This suggests that the timing of the oversight failures was not accidental but part of a broader electoral strategy. The legislative body then turned its attention to the role of the media in either exposing or obscuring these fiscal irregularities over the past decade. It was noted that while local independent outlets had raised alarms as early as 2018, larger regional publications were accused of downplaying the severity of the fraud. Witnesses argued that a narrative of unqualified success regarding Minnesota's refugee programs had been carefully curated to protect the state's reputation as a progressive bastion. This media complicity, whether intentional or the result of a shared ideological bias, allowed the corruption to fester far longer than it otherwise would have. The hearing suggested that the failure of the Fourth Estate to hold the Walz administration accountable played a critical role in the scale of the eventual disaster. Analysis of media coverage showed a consistent pattern of framing any criticism of the welfare programs as xenophobic or misinformed, effectively silencing legitimate concerns. This gatekeeping of information prevented the average citizen from understanding the true extent of the fiscal drain on their state. The hearing examined how the decline of local journalism has created an environment where government corruption can thrive without fear of exposure. It was argued that without a robust and independent media, the checks and balances required for a functioning democracy are fundamentally compromised. This failure of oversight extends beyond the government to include the very institutions that are supposed to serve as the people's watchdogs. Furthermore, the discussion delved into the international implications of the fraud, with some evidence suggesting that a portion of the stolen funds may have been transferred overseas. This raised significant national security concerns, as the committee questioned whether American taxpayer money was inadvertently funding entities outside the jurisdiction of U.S. law. The testimony included briefings from federal investigators who had tracked suspicious wire transfers originating from nonprofits linked to the Minnesota Food Program. While no direct link to terrorism was confirmed during the session, the sheer lack of transparency regarding the final destination of these funds was enough to warrant a federal expansion of the probe. This elevated the scandal from a local administrative failure to a matter of potential federal and international significance. The potential for these funds to have reached radicalized elements in the Horn of Africa was a recurring theme during the questioning of national security experts. They explained that the Somali diaspora maintains strong financial ties to their homeland, and without strict auditing, humanitarian funds can easily be diverted into illicit networks. The hearing emphasized that the Walz administration's failure to monitor these funds was not just a domestic budget issue but a potential hole in the nation's financial defense system. This realization added a layer of gravity to the proceedings, as lawmakers contemplated the broader consequences of regional negligence. The testimony served as a reminder that in a globalized world, local corruption can have global repercussions. In the final hours of this segment, the committee examined the impact on the legal system and the precedents set by the lack of high-level prosecutions. The hearing suggested that the discovery of such widespread deception has sparked a defensive reaction among the citizenry, leading to increased polarization. Lawmakers warned that if the state does not take drastic measures to restore confidence in its institutions, the social contract in Minnesota may be irreparably damaged. The testimony concluded with a call for a complete overhaul of the state's auditing process and a demand for a truly independent investigation into the executive branch. This sets the stage for a final confrontation between those seeking total transparency and those struggling to maintain the status quo of the current administration. The hearing ended with a poignant statement from a local community leader who expressed that true compassion requires accountability. They argued that by allowing fraud to go unpunished, the state was actually hurting the honest members of the Somali community who want to contribute and succeed. This perspective challenged the administration's narrative that oversight is somehow an act of hostility. Instead, it was framed as a necessary tool for ensuring that resources reach those who truly need them. As the session adjourned, the weight of the evidence suggested that the road to recovery for Minnesota would be long and fraught with political challenges. The fourth segment of this intensive congressional inquiry delved into the structural vulnerabilities of the American federalist system, specifically how state-level autonomy can be exploited to bypass federal standards of fiscal responsibility. Representative Brandon Gill shifted his focus toward the legal frameworks that allowed the Minnesota Department of Education and the Department of Human Services to operate with such a staggering degree of opacity. The testimony revealed a labyrinthine bureaucracy where responsibility was constantly shifted between departments, creating an accountability vacuum that savvy bad actors were quick to fill. Legal scholars providing testimony argued that the current crisis in Minnesota serves as a definitive case study for why federal oversight must be decoupled from local political influence. They detailed how federal mandates for meal programs were essentially treated as suggestions by state administrators, who prioritized rapid fund disbursement over the verification of identity or eligibility. The hearing then moved to examine the specific financial instruments used to funnel taxpayer dollars into the hands of shadow organizations. Forensic investigators presented a series of complex transaction maps that showed how money moved from the state treasury into a network of newly formed nonprofits, many of which shared the same physical addresses or board members. This clustering of organizations suggested a coordinated effort to overwhelm the state's auditing capacity by creating a sheer volume of paperwork that was impossible to verify in real time. The inquiry highlighted that many of these entities were approved for state funding despite having no prior history of charitable work or community service. This lack of a vetting process for new vendors was characterized as a systemic failure that invited exploitation on a massive scale. One of the most dramatic moments of the session occurred when a former state auditor took the stand to describe the internal pushback received when questioning the legitimacy of these rapid growth nonprofits. The witness described a climate where data-driven concerns were frequently dismissed in favor of equity-based outcomes, where the goal of reaching specific demographic quotas overrode the necessity of protecting public funds. This testimony painted a picture of a government that had lost its objective North Star, replacing meritocracy and auditing standards with a subjective system of political patronage. Lawmakers reacted with visible frustration as they realized that the red flags were not just missed, but were actively suppressed by higher-ups within the administration. This segment of the transcript serves as a chilling reminder of how administrative capture can occur when ideological goals take precedence over the rule of law. The discussion then expanded to the macroeconomic impact on Minnesota's long-term credit rating and fiscal health. Economists testifying before the committee warned that the state's current path is leading toward a structural deficit that cannot be solved by simply raising taxes on the remaining productive workforce. They presented data showing a significant flight of capital as high-earning individuals and businesses relocate to neighboring states with more transparent governance and lower social service burdens. The hearing explored the death spiral effect, where a shrinking tax base is forced to support an ever-growing dependent population, leading to further tax hikes and more capital flight. This economic analysis provided a sobering counterpoint to the administration's claims of social progress, suggesting that the current model is built on a foundation of unsustainable debt and misappropriated federal aid. Furthermore, the inquiry looked into the role of the judicial system in Minnesota and why legal challenges to these programs were so slow to materialize. It was revealed that many of the nonprofits involved had significant legal representation funded by the very state grants they were receiving. This created a paradoxical situation where the taxpayers were essentially paying for the legal defense of those accused of defrauding them. The testimony detailed how lawsuits filed by the state to recover funds were often met with countersuits alleging discrimination, which tied up the courts for years and allowed the fraud to continue in the interim. This strategic use of the legal system to delay accountability was described as a sophisticated form of lawfare designed to protect a lucrative revenue stream for partisan actors. As the hearing progressed into the evening, the focus shifted to the role of the Minnesota State Legislature and why the legislative branch failed to provide a check on the executive's power. Lawmakers from the minority party testified that their requests for subpoenas and special investigative committees were consistently blocked by the majority leadership, who were eager to protect the governor's national political standing. This portion of the testimony underscored the dangers of one-party rule, where the mechanisms of oversight are neutralized by the requirements of party loyalty. The hearing suggested that the failure in Minnesota was not just an executive one, but a total systemic collapse of the checks and balances intended to protect the citizenry. This revelation prompted calls for federal intervention, as it became clear that the state was unable or unwilling to investigate its own leadership. The inquiry also touched upon the demographic consequences of these policies, specifically how the concentration of social services in certain urban areas has altered the political and social geography of the state. Witnesses described the formation of ethnic enclaves, where the primary economic activity is the administration and consumption of government benefits. This lack of economic diversification within these communities was described as a tragedy for the immigrants themselves, who are being denied the opportunity to build generational wealth through entrepreneurship and labor. Instead, they are being incentivized to remain within a system that rewards compliance and political alignment over innovation and hard work. The hearing argued that this governance model creates a new feudalism, where a class of political elites manages a permanent dependent class through the distribution of public resources. In the final hours of this segment, the committee examined the influence of international NGOs and their role in facilitating the migration patterns that have stressed Minnesota's infrastructure. Testimony suggested that these organizations often work in tandem with state officials to maximize the intake of refugees, knowing that each new arrival generates a stream of federal and state funding for the NGO itself. This refugee industrial complex was described as a self-perpetuating cycle where the incentive is to increase the volume of arrivals regardless of the state's capacity to integrate them. The hearing concluded that until the profit motive is removed from the resettlement process, the pressure on Minnesota's social services will only continue to intensify. This sets the stage for the final part of the inquiry, which will focus on the proposed federal legislation to reclaim these funds and prevent such a crisis from ever happening again. The final act of this historic congressional inquiry shifted from the dissection of past failures to the construction of a future framework for accountability, marked by an atmosphere of intense resolution. Representative Brandon Gill, holding a thick stack of final subpoenas, addressed the room with a gravity that signaled the end of the era of administrative impunity in Minnesota. The testimony in this closing phase focused on the Restoring Taxpayer Trust Act, a proposed legislative overhaul designed to strip state governments of their ability to bypass federal auditing standards during periods of social crisis. Lawmakers argued that the Minnesota case had provided irrefutable evidence that without a secondary layer of federal oversight, the temptation to use public funds for political patronage is simply too great for partisan actors to resist. This segment of the hearing served as a call to action for a national realignment of how social safety nets are managed and protected from the corrosive influence of local identity politics. As the final witnesses took the stand, including high-ranking federal investigators and constitutional scholars, the conversation turned to the legal precedents for clawing back misappropriated funds from non-profit entities. The testimony detailed a strategy for utilizing the racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations, RICO, Act to pursue the organized networks that orchestrated the multimillion-dollar food program fraud. It was suggested that the scale and coordination of the theft in Minnesota met the legal definitions of a criminal enterprise, one that operated with the tacit approval of state officials. This legal perspective elevated the stakes from a matter of administrative negligence to a full-scale criminal investigation that could reach the highest levels of the governor's office. The room remained silent as the potential for future indictments was discussed, painting a grim picture for those who thought they could hide behind the complexity of state bureaucracy. A significant portion of this concluding session was dedicated to the emotional and social recovery of the state of Minnesota, which many argued had suffered a moral injury due to the betrayal by its leaders. Community leaders from across the political spectrum testified about the need for a truth and reconciliation process to address the racial and ethnic tensions exacerbated by the administration's selective enforcement of the law. They emphasized that the Somali community itself must not be viewed as a monolith of fraud, but as a group that was also victimized by the corrupt leaders who claimed to represent them. The hearing explored how the soft bigotry of low expectations had allowed criminals to thrive within immigrant enclaves, ultimately harming the reputation and integration of honest, hard-working newcomers. This nuanced discussion aimed to separate the actions of a corrupt few from the aspirations of a diverse citizenry, seeking a path toward healing that is rooted in justice rather than political correctness. The dialogue then turned toward the governor himself, with Representative Gill posing a series of rhetorical questions about the nature of leadership and the burden of knowledge. He argued that whether Governor Tim Walz was actively complicit or fundamentally incompetent, the result for the taxpayers was the same: a catastrophic loss of resources and trust. The hearing analyzed the deniability defense used by many executive leaders, where they claim ignorance of the actions of their subordinates to avoid personal liability. However, the committee presented evidence that the chain of command was sufficiently direct that such ignorance could only be classified as a deliberate choice. This segment of the transcript serves as a powerful indictment of a leadership style that prioritizes image over substance and loyalty over legality. Furthermore, the inquiry looked at the role of the upcoming election cycles and how the findings of this committee would be presented to the American public. There was a consensus among the majority members that the Minnesota scandal is not an isolated incident but a symptom of a broader crisis in American urban governance. They warned that if the patterns of fraud and political patronage seen in St. Paul are allowed to spread to other states, the entire national welfare system could face a collapse of public support. The testimony included warnings from fiscal hawks who predicted that a taxpayer revolt is inevitable if the government does not demonstrate a renewed commitment to transparency. The hearing suggested that the only way to prevent such a revolt is to provide the public with a full, unvarnished accounting of every dollar that was diverted or stolen. As the clock ticked toward the final adjournment, the committee turned its attention to the global stage, discussing how international observers and foreign governments view the American ability to self-correct. It was argued that the Minnesota scandal had weakened the United States' moral standing when lecturing other nations on corruption and the rule of law. By allowing such blatant fraud to occur within its own borders, the U.S. had provided ammunition to its geopolitical rivals who claimed that the American system is inherently rigged. The testimony emphasized that restoring the integrity of Minnesota's social services is not just a local issue, but a matter of national prestige and global influence. This elevated the mission of the committee to a patriotic duty, framing the investigation as a necessary cleansing of the democratic process. The closing statements of the various representatives highlighted a profound philosophical divide that will likely define American politics for the next generation. On one side, there was the call for a return to strict constitutional adherence, individual responsibility, and the colorblind application of the law. On the other, the dwindling defense of the progressive model, which justifies administrative shortcuts in the name of social equity and historical redress. The hearing made it clear that these two visions are increasingly incompatible and that the voters will eventually have to choose which path they want their country to follow. The evidence from Minnesota was presented as the ultimate cautionary tale of what happens when the latter vision is allowed to operate without the constraints of the former. In the final minutes, the atmosphere in the hearing room was one of somber reflection as the chairman summarized the thousands of pages of evidence collected over the course of the inquiry. He noted that while the financial cost was in the hundreds of millions, the cost to the social fabric of Minnesota was incalculable. He thanked the whistleblowers who risked their careers to bring the truth to light and promised that their bravery would not be in vain. The session ended with a formal referral of the committee's findings to the Department of Justice, marking the transition from a legislative inquiry to a potential criminal prosecution. As the gavel fell, the message was clear: the era of looking the other way is over, and the long road to accountability has officially begun. The final transcript concludes with a list of recommended reforms, including the mandatory use of biometric verification for all welfare recipients and the creation of an independent office of the taxpayer advocate with the power to freeze state spending. These proposals represent a radical departure from the status quo and a direct challenge to the administrative state that has governed Minnesota for decades. The hearing served as a manifesto for a new type of governance, one that is as rigorous in its auditing as it is compassionate in its intent. Whether these reforms will be enacted remains to be seen, but the testimony provided a clear and undeniable blueprint for how to save a state from the brink of fiscal and moral bankruptcy. The eyes of the nation now turn to Minnesota to see if it will have the courage to follow that blueprint and reclaim its heritage as a state of integrity and progress.